Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran, your storyteller today, and this is episode 34 of season 1. In the previous episode, I went over why the Cholas wanted to occupy Gangavadi at all. Clearly, their interests were much larger. And in practice, after they captured the Ganga kingdom, none of the Chola emperors or royals took residence or held political office in Talakadu, and all administration was left up to bureaucrats. The reason this is even a question is because the Cholas seemed less politically interested in the Ganga kingdom than they were in controlling the overland trade routes that passed through it. So, it was not politics or emotions or ego or any kind of a sentiment that drove their military campaigns. It was business. They had a thriving maritime trade and a strong navy with deep-sea military capabilities to carry out long-range operations. This enabled them to dominate the maritime trade routes on the eastern seaboard, and then they developed markets for their goods in the west, and for that, they needed to move goods overland from the Tamil Nadu ports through Andhra, Karnataka, and onto the Kerala and Karnataka ports, where the Arabs dominated the sea routes to all the western markets. The network of merchants and manufacturers depended on the safe passage of goods between the coasts and paid well for protection, and they also paid taxes, and as I mention often, this is how the kings of the southern Deccan became rich. And as for the Cholas, who owned a great part of the international trade, they needed to focus on the right things and keep their eye on the prize. Annexing and running kingdoms for politics was not their priority. And to achieve this goal efficiently, and we should give them the credit for this, they developed management systems, many of which are used to this day. In today's episode, I will walk you through the important parts of what the Cholas did in the century that they ruled Gangavadi. But first, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who helped me make this podcast possible. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. When Rajendra Chola had occupied Gangavadi in 1004 AD, the Cholas started to set up a completely new set of administration techniques in the country. Gone were the local feudal lords who had ruled as petty rajas. The traditional method was that the kingdom would be parceled off to local feudal lords or feudatories or vassals, and they ran everything in their principalities, from collecting taxes to general administration. These vassals reported to the king, and they had to pay him a share of taxes, other tributes, and also supply the kingdom with armed forces whenever asked to. But these local feudal lords did not maintain a trained standing army like the kingdom could, and it stands to reason that the forces supplied by these local chieftains would have been drawn from farmers and other poor folk in the area, and they would form the front line, sacrificed for the glory of the king and the greed of the feudatory. The Cholas dismissed all these local lords, and they replaced them with bureaucrats, generals, and trained officials. The principal difference between the traditional methods of the old kingdoms and what the Cholas set in place is that they controlled everything themselves, and they wouldn't outsource kingly duties or royal functions to feudatories. To run the Gangavadi, the Cholas mirrored whatever they were doing in other parts that they controlled. So the area of the Gangavadi was first divided into large territories in cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And each of these locations was headed by a senior bureaucrat, and he controlled different departments, with each department completely staffed with trained bureaucrats. According to historian Burton Stein, the Cholas tended to focus strongest in the rich and densely populated Kaveri Delta. Now, as a dynasty, the Cholas asserted a strong affiliation with the river Kaveri, to which they attributed their own origins, calling it the Ganga of the south. Now, outside this central region of their interest, they used their power in a much more symbolic rather than in a direct manner, where they used rituals and traditions to assert their authority. But clearly, they valued the entire Gangavadi enough to place a decent number of bureaucrats in charge of affairs. Now, their kingdom was divided into zones, each with varying levels of control and organization. However, this structure is not clearly described in their inscriptions or any literature, and historians have had to infer it by analyzing all the available evidence. But the larger point here is that there was a system of management where everything did not have to be decided by the king, and all administration was left up to managers who were empowered to take decisions and who were bound by a set of well-defined rules. Now, this was new. So new that they didn't even have a way to describe it in jargon that could be applied to the time they did it. And because there wasn't a clear theory about this sort of statecraft, scholars used what is called the segmentary state theory, which was introduced by British anthropologist Aidan Southall in Africa. That book explained the workings of the Alur tribe in Uganda, and this did more than any else to describe how the Chola political system worked. Aidan Southall's segmentary state theory is basically about how power in a kingdom is strongest at the center and gets weaker in the outer regions, with the ruler relying more on influence and strategic agreements rather than in direct control. All this worked great for the Cholas. They also set about renaming places and areas, such as changing Talakadu's name to Rajarajapura, but I will skip past all that because, like all place name changes, it seemed like it was a cosmetic exercise. But they also made one crucial change. They handed over all the power that they had taken away from the Palegars or the feudal lords and gave it to the villages, to village assemblies, so they may enjoy self-determination. Now, the Cholas must be appreciated for this. They were known for their system of local self-government, and many of the things that they did were pioneering for its time, techniques that continue to this day. And it is worthwhile for me to spend some time describing the structure of administration because everyone will be able to see immediate parallels with how things are done today in the villages. So first of all, the villages had their own administrations, with the Cholas officials serving only as observers rather than with rulers or officials with any direct control. They really had none. They devolved the whole thing to the village assemblies. And speaking of village assemblies, at the heart of the system were three assemblies called the Uru, the Sabha, and the Nagaram. Now, village assemblies were the most dynamic and comprehensive in their activities, and they surpassed even the corporate efforts of the Nadus and the Nagarams. The Uru was a general assembly, and it was open to all tax-paying villagers, although it must be said that the seasoned elders often took charge of the governing council. Now, the Sabha, or the Mahasabha, was exclusive to Brahmins in the Brahmadeya villages and operated through committees called the Varyams, which handled specific duties. The reason for this was because they felt that they must place well-educated people in charge of the larger efforts so that they could influence and guide the different levels of administration to do what they were supposed to do. This is exactly like the parliamentary system, where the Rajya Sabha is supposed to be composed of people of note from the land. Of all these things, the Sabha looms large in Chola inscriptions, and it reflects its prominence in governance. And finally, the Nagarams represented the merchant community in villages involved in trade. Together, these assemblies gave Chola villages a very, very high degree of autonomy. They had the right to govern themselves in full, from collecting taxes to resolving disputes, building and managing infrastructure such as roads, tanks, and irrigation canals. The structures lent themselves to a system of checks and balances, and because there would have been enough of opposing interests, it would have been very, very difficult for anybody local to have created some kind of a grand conspiracy, because it necessarily had to include everyone, including the overseers from the Chola Empire. That was simply not possible. In many cases, even the central government needed the approval of the local villages to carry out work in those areas. But all this democracy where the people got the power, did not suit the feudal lords at all. Summarily dismissed from their position as local rajas and all their administrative powers handed over to the village assemblies did not suit their purposes one bit. So, several of them, almost 20 of them, met and discussed their lot. Unwilling to wait, they decided to attack the Cholas, and they started drawing up plans for battle that they would take right to the Cholas, right to the gates of Talakadu. How did this end? After this commercial break, I will be back to tell you what happened at the Battle of Kaliyur and after. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hi, I'm back. The Battle of Kaliyur happened about 2 years after the fall of Talakadu, which was in 1004 AD, in the battle between Rakasa Ganga and Rajendra Chola. And now, 2 years later, a group of feudal lords, former feudatories and rajas of the Gangas, had decided to band together and attack the Chola army. The Cholas had taken away their lordly privileges and handed the administration of the Gangavadi to each and every village. And so now they would have to become no more than ordinary citizens. There were some theories about why the chieftains chose to attack Cholas. One such theory is that the Cholas had taken 900,000 men into the country and pillaged and plundered the countryside. But historians have discredited these theories because they lack proof. And although the Cholas were known to be brutal towards the enemy and did things like cut off their noses, the basis for such large-scale and extreme atrocities seems very unlikely when weighed against all the other evidence, such as when they took away power from the feudal lords and put it into the hands of the local village assemblies across the Gangavadi to govern themselves. The two don't sit well together. So the simplest, and therefore the most plausible explanation, is that the chieftains were dispossessed of their fiefdoms and wanted things to go back the way they were. Whatever be the motivation, the morning of the attack must have been a morning of mixed emotions. Each general and each of the men who would march into battle would have been excited, their adrenaline flowing. The morning of the battle would have started off, both sides, with the families of each fighting man wondering if he would come home. Prayers would have been offered by everyone. The senior officers, from generals down, would have gone to the temples and propitiated the gods to help them with the battle, and the foot soldiers wherever they could. On the side of the coalition, the adrenaline-driven excitement would have been mixed in with dread, abject, horrible dread. That ragtag mob, which is the only way to describe them, was going to face the mightiest army of the south. The smarter among them would have known the truth. They were not coming home. Prayers apart, they needed to do something more practical to be able to fight this battle. And going by the records of traveler historians like Xuanzang, how men and armies were prepped and trained for battle in that period of time was that the untrained men and elephants were given copious amounts of alcohol before the battle began in order that they would simply blindly go to war and create as much havoc as they could or die in the process. This is not a tale of glory. It's not a tale of high emotion. No war is. Because most among those who died in the war would have been men who had no choice but to fight, rarely on principle and almost never for profit, because they were going to die for another man, for his personal gain. In a general comment about war in his book Byline, Ernest Hemingway, writing as a war correspondent, made the trenchant comment, and I quote, "War is fought by men who are enslaved into the bearing of arms and are taught to be more afraid of sure death from their officers if they run than possible death if they stay in the line of attack. And thus, the lives of ordinary people have been sacrificed for the greed and the vanity of a few men. Anyway, war has also always been a reality. And such was the morning of Prabhava Chaitra Shaka 929, which translates to the 10th of March 1006, when the armies of 18 feudal lords who had been ruling various parts of the Gangavadi assembled each of their armies at the little village of Kaliyur. Now, the village of Kaliyur lies across the Kaveri, about 4 kilometers south of Talakadu, measured in a straight line. This village used to be called Kalavur. The Chola family were not at the scene because they did not live in Talakadu, so the defense of Talakadu was in the hands of their general Aprameya. Any information about this battle comes from a Chola inscription written in the Kannada of the period. This inscription was embedded in the ceiling of the Gopalakrishna temple when it was found by Benjamin Lewis Rice, who published it in Epigraphia Karnatica. But the most reliable account of the battle I found is in an essay by Hanumantarao in the Shrikanta Shastri Felicitation volume titled Shrikantika. This inscription gives us a vivid account of the battle. It says that the general Aprameya faced a combined attack from a confederation of local chieftains who confronted the Cholas right at the gates of Talakadu. But the battle ended in a disaster for the Confederates. Aprameya inflicted a crushing defeat, and many chiefs were killed and the others fled in disarray. There were names of leaders mentioned in the inscription, and among them were several recognizable names that can be linked to different principalities and kingdoms around the Gangavadi. But among all of these leaders of this confederacy, there is mention of a Hoysala chief. He was praised multiple times in this inscription and even called the Gandhara Bhima, though his personal name is never mentioned. And now, here's the intriguing part. Some historians wonder if this Hoysala chief might have been the founder of the Hoysala dynasty. His repeated mentions suggest that this could well be. But historian Hanumantarao believes that this Hoysala isn't the same Sala who founded the Hoysala dynasty. And without concrete evidence, it's impossible to say for sure, and this will remain a mystery. The Battle of Kaliyur resulted in several conclusions and results. For the 18 feudal lords to have underestimated the Cholas, or indeed overestimated themselves maybe, was ill-considered and hasty, and it only wound up consolidating Chola rule for the next 100 years. Next, whatever might have been the situation of the last Ganga king Rakasa after the 1004 Battle of Talakadu, he was still a presence in the area, and now Rakasa gave his allegiance to the Cholas. There is another matter of importance to do with all this, and that is the rise of the Hoysalas. Whether or not they were involved in the Battle of Kaliyur, there is a notion that even by coincidence, this battle was related to the rise of the formidable Hoysala kingdom, who would go on to drive the Cholas out of the Gangavadi and take it for themselves. Sometimes, history is measured by attendant matters such as how people are described on inscriptions. As historian Duncan Derrett pointed out, the feudal chiefs who attacked Talakadu are not referred to with the same sort of tone that is reserved for the more respected leaders. And in time, all descriptions of the Hoysalas give even the lay reader the notion that they were a sophisticated people, something that would go on to be proved in all accounts of this emerging dynasty. For example, the Hoysala Empire's rise in power and wealth introduced a touch of grandeur even to titles of minor officials. It meant that these are people who took themselves very seriously and projected it in everything that they did. Now, many of these individuals, once modest figures, began adopting names and designations imbued with the elegance and prestige that befits an empire at its zenith. It was a great show. It was a reflection of how authority, no matter how small, gained that touch of sophistication. And then, history put pen to paper for the start of a new chapter And that is the chapter of the Hoysalas. In my next episode, I will go over the rise of the Hoysalas and the circumstances that led to their taking over of the Gangavadi from the Cholas. The Deccan has always been an exciting place in history. All of that coming up soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.